Hello. This video is a critique of Battlefield 1, a follow-up from a previous video of the same name, albeit in a more serious, sincere tone this time. In part 1, I very sarcastically expressed my viewpoint of how I think Battlefield 1's multiplayer is the closest of the main series to Call of Duty in terms of the gameplay encouraged. The video was intentionally disparaging, as I believe this transformation to be a negative one for a multitude of reasons, of which this video exists to clarify. I will also use this as a chance to discuss how many aspects of the gameplay and overall tone seem to be conflicted with one another, and lament what I believe to be a missed opportunity for a far more meaningful and memorable experience than what we ultimately got, with some speculation on why this is the case. As always, unless stated otherwise prior to mention, all discussion to follow will be of my opinion only, from my very limited perspective as one single conscience in this world. So when speaking of the multiplayer, Battlefield 1 was and is overall a huge disappointment for me. I've been a fan of the series since Battlefield 2 and have greatly enjoyed its numerous adaptations up until Battlefield 3, where the series' core identity began to show very notable corruption in the form of simplified gameplay mechanics and map design. Battlefield has never particularly been about realistic combat simulation, but instead always rode the line between arcade-style gameplay with a more methodical pace, married with deeper team-play-based mechanics. Any competent player could jump in and perform reasonably well, but to excel and get the most out of the experience, dependence upon your teammates' support was mandatory. The series knew what it was and played to its strengths, and was all the more satisfying for it. Fast forward to BF1, and we now have but a shadow of this experience. The simpler period of a World War I setting means we'd naturally see the omission of classic features such as the Commander mode and all that came with it, and a less diverse roster of vehicles and potentially weapons. But some of the team play mechanics still remain. We can still use the Commo Rose system to communicate with one another, we can resupply, heal and revive each other, and fixing vehicles is still possible. But seldom is such deliberate behavior undertaken by players in BF1. This is primarily due to the same reasons mentioned in Part 1, because of how the many design choices have diminished or eliminated player agency, consideration, and dependency on one another. Some of said changes dating back to Battlefield 3. I'm aware that some predate BF3 in the spin-off titles such as Bad Company, but for simplicity my focus will be only on the main titles. Even the most minor of gameplay changes can dramatically affect the course of a game's design. As an example of how a design choice can potentially diminish a whole game experience, we need look no further than the addition of Unlimited Sprint. As tiny as it may seem, in actuality it has the potential to majorly affect gameplay on multiple levels. First, it dramatically speeds up overall infantry gameplay, which in turn disincentivizes the need for vehicle transport, which in turn reduces the particular opportunity for teamwork and the future value of basic vehicles. The continuous attainment of a higher speed changes the mindset of the player and how the game world is to be interacted with. There is a constant rushing feeling one associates with endless sprinting. Thus, everything starts to feel more like a race, and rushing from point to point becomes the dominant methodology. In turn, players no longer need to consider conserving stamina, so they might have enough to flee in case of any surprises. A level of forethought in movement has now been subsequently eliminated. Preparation and caution is abandoned in place of reckless haste. Everyone is moving much faster now, so time to kill is reduced, as maintaining target on a rapidly moving enemy would result in too many hit markers with too few kills, which in turn results in weapon inaccuracy being toned down to accommodate. Weapons begin to feel homogeneous, with exception of fire rate they lose their unique characteristics and quirks per type. Animations, particularly reloading, are then also sped up to match this pace. Deaths are now naturally occurring more frequently, so respawn times are cut and/or more respawning options are added. The developers now notice that transport vehicles are seldom used, so objectives are placed closer together and the map design gradually shifts into narrower and narrower forms. Players are not working together as much as before. It seems they're too caught in the rush mindset, zipping around the arena, dying as quickly as they kill and respawning faster and closer than ever. So then team play aspects have to become automated, lest the dominant pace be broken. Deliberate attention to examine the condition of, or listen out for requests from your comrades for health and ammo requirements is replaced by an area of effect dump and forget ammo and health box. So even the selfish player, unattentive to his team and caring only for his own condition, will still be inaccurately hailed as a team player and rewarded appropriately. In turn, aided by the choke points they are funneled through owing to the new map design, players will now seldom need to ask for health and supplies, as a box will usually be present at said choke points. But in the rare case a player finds themselves without supplies because of the high accuracy and time to kill, at the very least they must be able to regenerate their health, at least after some time. And we can't forget about the ever more redundant vehicles that will now also have to have regeneration or be able to fix themselves to compensate for their dwindling popularity and how so few players are still willing to consciously play a support role. Let us remind ourselves that all of these changes, are the potential results of one seemingly innocuous adjustment to player ability. An entirely different gameplay experience emerges, far divorced from its original conception, identifiable on the surface level only. The core experience becomes a thoughtless automation, devoid of the humanity and camaraderie that occurs through genuine dependence on one another. And so gone too are the connections built through the appreciation and admiration garnered through witnessing the act of genuine compassion and concern for each other's well-being, while simultaneously pursuing a common goal. This is how I perceive the experience of Battlefield 1's multiplayer, a far cry from what the previous titles used to be. Now, I'm not saying these changes have come to pass in the manner aforementioned. I've no way to truly know how this progression actually manifested. There is quite a clear correlation at the very least, though, when game design is led by dominant player trends as opposed to the developer's vision. I find this style of gameplay to be incredibly jarring when comparing BF1 to first-person shooters of similar ilk, solely because the World War I setting feels to be an extremely ill fit for this style. I've very limited knowledge of the war proper, but when I think to the manner of warfare engaged in during the time period, I envisage a much slower and methodical pace of action, and I suspect most others would too. Because of the much simpler technology of the time, long and short-distance communication was difficult and unreliable, not to mention easily disrupted and intercepted. Tanks, combat vehicles, and various forms of heavy artillery saw their invention and came into play later during the war, but only a small number were ever deployed. Automatic weapons were still in their infancy and impractical to carry, so combat dependence fell mainly on single-shot rifles. It was a time lacking in haste and automation typically provided by reliable communication means, automatic weapons, and devastating explosive strikes capable of being ordered and executed within seconds. And so, I'd guess reliance mainly fell upon direct communication with those in your immediate vicinity. Your eyes and ears and words, and your 10 RPM rifle, with little else. A very close-knit, intimate setting, no doubt, where every laborious action had to have been as deliberate as possible. Your base senses, your brothers-in-arms senses, and communication of these to one another are paramount above all else to stay alive. This could have made for a very compelling infantry experience in BF1 if they were able to capture some of that back-to-basics simplicity and layer it appropriately with the typical teamwork mechanics we've come to know and love from the series. Some very meaningful team play could have been forged. In fact, it seemed from the initial reveal of the game that they were going for just this. There was talk of boots-on-the-ground gameplay that consumers were clamoring for after tiring of the superhuman futuristic modern setting that dominated FPSs at the time. Together with the beautiful visuals and attention to detail possible with the Frostbite 3 engine, it seemed all was set for one of the most immersive portrayals of World War I in a computer game to date. What we got was far from immersion, however. BF1's gameplay and tone seem at odds with one another. On the one hand, we have, as expected, incredible attention to detail in both visuals, sound, and historical accuracy. Much care and attention was poured into the crafting of the world and its setting. There are so many minute details the developers added with the clear aim of enhancing player immersion. The subtle sound of shell casings impacting the ground will differ accurately depending on the surface. Your gun will become muddy when going prone in muddy areas, and even more impressive, if the weather is rainy, the mud will gradually be washed off the gun over time. Environmental objects will be affected depending on the weather, such as a windmill's turning speed. Mundane items, such as the various destructible boxes, have historically accurate markings. Even the tins used as IEDs on rush mode are each unique and historically accurate to their faction. The same painstaking detail gets extended to vehicle tires and the markings on them. And for the last example, going back to weather-environment interactions, on a multiplayer map called Amiens, when it is raining, water will flow from particular drain pipes onto the ground. Further inspection reveals that this will only happen with drain pipes that have an opening exposed to the sky. Closed drain pipes will not have water flowing out of them. The latter is astonishing attention to detail, which borders on near OCD levels. The fact the person or persons involved in the level design stopped to consider this tiny detail shows a true love for their craft and respect for the subject matter at hand. And it seems the time taken to add these details may very well have been done under the impression the player would be provided opportunities to become aware of them. So how sad it is, then, that these details, and more I have omitted for the sake of time, will never be registered and appreciated by the vast, vast majority of players. Because the hectic, shallow gameplay and accompanying intrusions it brings into the world are so constant and demanding of the player's attention that they haven't a moment of respite to allow these details the chance to be noticed and immerse them, subsequently enhancing their play experience. The game's soundtrack, which has been playing in the background throughout this video, features beautifully composed orchestral pieces, some invoking a sense of determination and struggle, while others go for a melancholic, almost mournful tone, clearly made with the mind to have the listener reflect upon the very great struggles faced during those times. The very first story mission further reinforces this notion, attempting to pull at your heartstrings and evoke the tragedy of war by forcing your player characters to die, then displaying their name, birth year, and death, informing you of just how young some of these soldiers were, before transferring you quickly to another doomed body, for the process to repeat once again. But then, after this very brief opening which showed promise, all subsequent story missions completely undermine this theme by having the player become a literal one-man army, single-handedly slaughtering hundreds of enemy soldiers through various scripted set pieces between campaigns. If you think that kind of improbable slaughter is jarring but not quite immersion-breaking, then the absolutely abysmal AI will seal the deal. Their behavior is immersion-shattering to say the least. The first part of the Italian campaign I found particularly so. You're immediately placed in body armor and become a juggernaut, and then proceed to methodically mow down the enemy while soaking up hundreds of bullets, before then manning a lone anti-aircraft gun to bring down an entire fleet of enemy bombers and their entourage. I could see the former of these two events being a somewhat impactful and believable moment if only the AI would have behaved appropriately, having them running in fear and confusion as you menacingly marched forward, indifferent to their attack, while being properly supported by your allies, causing them to desperately focus all fire on you, giving said allies time to move in unopposed and eliminate them from a flank. I took the time to highlight an example from the single player because it shows most clearly the divorce between gameplay and theme. Passionately composed orchestral pieces, intimate environmental detail from visuals to sound, designed to draw you into the world, all corrupted and marred by a downright childish approach to gameplay. One could argue that single-player campaigns, such as in the older World War II games, typically always feature a one-man army player slaughtering hundreds upon hundreds of enemies, and that it is unfair to criticize BF1 for merely continuing on this accepted trend. This is true, but the standard was so much lower back then. The bar has now been elevated for visuals and sound to a near lifelike degree. The standard of gameplay must also rise to match this, and cannot remain as simplistic as it was back then, else the game makes a mockery of itself in the eyes of the player. I can only speculate that BF1 may have begun development as a far more grounded and intimate experience than what was ultimately delivered, or that the teams in charge of world design and gameplay were not in alignment. Either way, I think a great opportunity has been missed for what could have been a very memorable, meaningful, and respectful rendition of the Great War offered to a mainstream audience. one that would have helped the idea of gaming as an art form to be taken far more seriously. But it seems there is still more growing up to be done. Many, if not all of my frustrations regarding the multiplayer mentioned in Part 1 had quite an obvious counter-argument to be used against them, which I anticipated but surprisingly never received in the comments. The developers were kind enough to include a very comprehensive set of customization options to tweak your play experience as you see fit. In theory, all my issues could be alleviated this way. Too many meat grinders? Then I could filter and find a match with less players. Dislike 3D spotting? Turn it off. Spawn on squad leader only, like in the old battlefields? That can be done too. Health regeneration? Off. It can all be done. But here's the thing. No one is taking the time to utilize these options, at least not anymore. Everyone is accepting the default experience as is. So then you may say that this is proof that I am the minority. Players simply don't care for the method of play that I have been mourning the loss of over 2 YouTube videos now. The players nowadays are happy with what it is, and I should turn my attention to another title, one that would better serve my needs. To address this argument, I need to highlight and focus on the statement, players simply don't care. And my answer to that is, well, yes and no. Yes, players don't care in that they want to get on with playing the game at hand. It offers enough entertainment to stay sufficiently amused, and any unfavorable aspects will have to be accepted for now, hopefully being ironed out for the next title. They just want to play and enjoy. They trust the developers will recognize their needs and develop the next titles accordingly. And I say no, because players, and humans by their nature, do not as a whole automatically seek or even desire experiences that are more in-depth and meaningful, thus providing a far greater level of enjoyment. This is because such experiences will usually be gated behind challenge and time. We tend to come across them as a matter of consequence, and the struggle to overcome the challenge therein becomes the meaningful enjoyment, unbeknownst to us initially. Attaining mastery over something, real or abstract, is one of the greatest sources of life-sustaining meaning a person may possibly find, and is no doubt a key driving force of our social development and dominance over our world. To improve, to get better, and to notice this improvement is a simple, universal joy that transcends cultures. Most serious challenges we cannot undertake by ourselves, however, at least not to any great effect, and so we turn to our fellow man and form alliances with one another. Experiences are shared, connections are formed, even greater meaning, enjoyment, and satisfaction may be attained. As an individual person, we are quite weak and incapable, some more than others. And I believe this to be one of the reasons, alongside obvious biological imperative, that we opt for the path of least resistance. Who wants to intentionally struggle and endure hardship after all, unless you're a masochist? We may have world-changing ideas swirling around in our heads, but we would always need others to aid and support us in our path to realizing them. If we might have any imperative as humans beyond procreation, then ensuring that we continue to develop ourselves, becoming stronger and smarter, and just be plain better and more capable than our ancestors before us, could very well be the next most important. Passing that idea on to our children is vital, so that they may learn from our errors and eventually surpass us. As convenience technology has advanced more and more to the modern day, there is far less necessity to personally face challenges. So we of course have become less inclined towards acceptance of things that we know can be completed with ease by external means. Humans are getting busier and busier with empty tasks disguised as meaningful ones, so life is going faster and faster. Facing challenges takes time and careful attention to complete, while also being able to learn from them. Time we increasingly feel to be lacking. Even meaningful social interaction, one of our most important means of healthy functionality and development and joy, has been reduced down to instantaneous messaging, as brief as we can make them. Grammar, spelling, and punctuality be damned. We spend large portions of our day distracted to near zombification levels by smart technology. I'd be willing to bet this century's human has the lowest attention span in the history of our species. As a result, things must go faster and faster. Anything below instant is becoming less and less acceptable. Our distraction with the now is causing us to neglect the future and the past. Challenge, trial, difficulty. are not synonymous with fast or instant, so we're rejecting them whenever possible, and discarding their potential for enjoyment far, far deeper than anything provided instantly can offer. This is not a new revelation. Our ancestors have been sharing this wisdom for eons now. It's a time-proven concept. But we are now seriously ignoring it while offering very little alternative. And our intentional ignorance of this is beginning to leak into some of the most influential spheres of our culture, the gaming sphere being one of them, as evidenced by Battlefield 1 and many other titles. With all this in mind, today's average human, well adjusted to instant gratification, is very unlikely to take the time and effort required to customize and create an experience to their personal liking, even if they stand to gain a far superior experience for doing so. So for a popular game like Battlefield 1, regardless of its wealth of customization options, players will typically just jump in as fast as they can. After all, they're already quite used to having most things in their life automated by now. Despite not meaning to be, I will likely sound very condescending and arrogant with my next sentence. Today's average players are unable to conceptualize the best experience for themselves beyond the immediate present. The ability of forethought and deeper understanding towards what would provide a far more satisfying experience has been stifled by modern living. And I believe developers too, as humanly flawed as the rest of us, are not exempt from this. What's worse, the average player is now relied upon for direct feedback and for product testing before public release. Wielding such influential power, if their aptitude to show forethought and seeing the game not as just a personal but collective experience has been compromised, then it spells for disaster. Not only for the near future of games, also the distant future that our children will occupy. If we at the very least accept the premise that we have a responsibility to make sure future generations surpass us, then by eliminating challenge and automating as many processes as we can, we are surely failing in our responsibility. The mind typically does not improve its capability through ease and convenience. All this is to say, at the risk of sounding condescending once more, that many players could be having a far more inspiring and enjoyable experience with games like Battlefield 1, but they've lost touch with the ability to conceive this potential, even when presented with the options to do so. Which is why I also say no to the idea that players simply don't care for the deeper, more challenging gameplay and mechanics offered by previous Battlefields anymore. I just believe they have forgotten, or have never had the chance to experience the joy that can be extracted from depending on themselves and others when truly working together. Automating gameplay mechanics such as 3D spotting have no doubt been possible to implement within such games for the longest time. In fact, they have already existed in similar form as cheats and hacks. But there is a reason why it wasn't implemented in titles like Battlefield 2. It would have been rightly recognized as fundamentally compromising and diminishing of the overall gameplay experience back then. As the old adage goes, it's the journey, not the destination. If the idea is accepted or at least entertained that players are losing sight of what's best for themselves and the medium, then popular developers need to properly become aware of their status and position as a potential global influence for the present and future, and perhaps even more importantly, for the future standards and expectations of their audience, which would echo beyond gaming and into culture itself. Gaming is now a big enough medium to have a direct impact on culture. The act of playing a game is a multifaceted activity in which a person must employ a diverse set of skills to successfully participate in. And whether they like it or not, successful developers have a hand in the shaping of our minds. Much like any good story and activity, their games can directly affect the development and ideas of minds, young and old. The challenges and skills they guide their audience to master will have a tangible effect on how they interact with the real world and what paths they choose to take in it. The influence games can potentially have are no different to that of a famous celebrity idolized by millions, or a greatly regarded story that holds important life lessons for us to absorb. In each of these examples, the celebrity and story have a responsibility in their existence to be a good example of betterment for each one's audience. Game worlds can potentially contain within them all the things we have used throughout the ages as a means to better ourselves. Inspiring characters, moving music, a wondrous world to learn of, and interactive gameplay mechanics that can test and develop our abilities, all while thoroughly enjoying ourselves at the same time. If the audience is failing to recognize the need for betterment and continue opting for the least resistance, then it's up to the developers to guide them in the right direction. The standard should be set higher and more demanded from the audience and themselves. This power, this opportunity, can be used to ensure we're getting better and more skilled as people, not worse. After all, that's the responsible thing to do.